resources are still going to be needed, no matter how the world gets reordered after what Trump is doing. And we may want to trade with other countries. In fact, I argued in my recent piece that not only should we look to try to trade with other countries, but we should actually go back to some of the trade agreements we've had, like with Europe and Asian countries, and even go further to reduce tariffs and non-trade barriers that we can. And I hope that we can actually work out something with the United States. Maybe we'll be after Trump leaves.
Welcome to Power Struggle. I'm the host, Stewart Muir, and this is the 6th episode of a special federal election campaign series that we've been doing. We're tackling the big issues shaping the election and really Canada's future. We're looking particularly at issues related to energy. That's what we're all about at Power Struggle. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Jack Mintz. Jack's an economist, and he's also the President's Fellow in Public Policy at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. He's one of the most distinguished economists on the scene. I've had the chance to interview him, and I always appreciate what he has to say. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thank you, Stewart.
As an advisor on economic policy over your long career, tell me, Jack, what's the biggest win you've ever scored, so to speak, over your career? That one thing where your advice was taken and something happened.
Oh dear, there's probably a few good examples I can give of that, but probably one of the most important things I did was chair a panel on business tax reform for the Honorable Paul Martin when he was Minister of Finance. And we had a very good group of people. We made some very significant recommendations on business tax reform. And initially, the government was a bit slow in trying to moving ahead, but then after a year, they did, and there was very significant change done to the corporate tax system in Canada as a result of that report. The provinces actually followed along too and adopted a number of the recommendations and philosophy of the report. And so it certainly had its impact that I was very pleased with.
So that was the government of Paul Martin, who was a Liberal Prime Minister of Canada. Have you advised prime ministers or governments from across the political spectrum in your time?
Yes, I have. I also advised Stephen Harper and his government when, during his time. I've also, worked earlier on at finance in the Department of Finance from 1984 to 86 when John Turner was just appointed as the prime minister, and then went into election and lost it. And so the Mulroney government came in, and I was at the Department of Finance working on corporate tax reform. And in fact, I wrote a document at that time that came out with Michael Wilson's 1985 budget on restructuring the corporate tax. And again, a number of things were adopted out of that reform as well. So I had that experience. Plus, I've had a number of things at the international level that I've done over the years as I worked with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, and others on tax reform, sometimes on federal fiscal relations in some of the federal countries, sometimes on some aspects related to goods and services taxes or value-added taxes. A host of things that I've done over the years that involve governments of different stripes. And in Canada, I worked with a number of the provinces, and including even giving advice to whether it was the NDP in Saskatchewan or the Liberals in Prince Edward Island or the Conservatives in some of the other provinces as well. So I've had a varied background, which I've enjoyed over the years.
So you're a great example of an impartial advisor on information that you validated as a PhD economist.
Yes, I think I've always told people how I felt, and some people liked the message, so they adopted it. Some other people maybe didn't like it, and so they didn't want to have my advice, but that was fine. I told no matter who was in power, or who was seeking my advice, they would hear the same thing from me no matter what.
This will sound like a dumb question, so I hope you will permit me without mocking me. What is the economy and how does it work?
Well, an economy, I guess, is defined as all the value of all the transactions that are made in an economy between households and firms, among firms. They're buying and selling goods and services. Households are supplying labor and maybe capital to firms to produce things. It's a very circular picture in which money rolls around. And of course, the important thing about economics is that it tries to explain how decisions are made to optimize the value of things for households and for firms as a result of people just making their transactions in their best interest.
You're a PhD in economics. You're from Edmonton, Alberta. There's another PhD in economics from Edmonton, name of Mark Carney, who's in the news a lot. Probably why we're talking today. I mean, how many PhDs in economics come from Edmonton? Is it a thing up there?
Well, of course, there are PhDs. I didn't get my PhD from Alberta. I was born and raised in Edmonton.
Right, you come from Edmonton.
And I went to the University of Alberta for my undergraduate degree. And then I went on and did a master's at Queen's University. I worked a year at the now defunct Economic Council of Canada, and then met my wife at the end of the year, and we went off to England, where I did my PhD for 3 years, and then I came back and I taught at Queen's for 11 years, and University of Toronto with 18 years, and then I went out to Calgary to start up the new School of Public Policy at University of Calgary.
Now, I heard that Mark Carney got the same scholarship as you to get his PhD in the UK.
I understand he got a Commonwealth Fellowship, and so did I. It was a very competitive process at that time. They awarded Commonwealth Fellowships, the UK government did, to a lot of the old colonies of the British Empire, and now referred to as the Commonwealth by that point. Canada got 10 of them every year. And so I was very lucky to get one. I was very pleased to get it. And it was tremendous support to have in the first 2 years. In fact, I turned down a scholarship, a Canada Council scholarship, because I did get the Commonwealth. But then in my third year, I took the Canada Council one because Commonwealth was good for 2 years.
Jack, I must say you come across as calm and rational, the epitome of a scholar in economics. But in seeing your writings of late and some of the things that when we were on a stage together in Vancouver, I detected a man frustrated by circumstances that are around us in the Canadian economy. Can you tell me about this frustration you're experiencing?
Well, I think it really goes back to, I think, the past 10 years. As I mentioned, I worked back in 1984 in my 6th year at Queen's University. I spent 2 years at the Department of Finance. I saw, the operation of government at that time. The Mulroney government came in. They had some big ideas, including tax reform, of which the goods and services tax was one of the pillars that later came into being. But also there was the free trade agreement with the United States that was done. I think that was a tremendous move forward. Mulroney also tried to deal with Canada's constitutional problems, and particularly try to get through the Meech Lake Accord that didn't go through. And so he got 2 out of 3 things done, but he certainly had some success as a prime minister, and the government at that time had success. And then I was around as a Clifford Clark visiting economist at finance in 1996 and 1997.
So Jean Chrétien, prime minister at that time?
Yes, Chrétien was the prime minister, and Paul Martin was the minister of finance.
Waiting in the wings.
And I was brought in at a very high level to deal with both budget issues as well as chairing a business tax reform panel that I mentioned earlier on. And there were a lot of good things done during that period, particularly dealing with the terrible deficit that we had. Tremendous progress that was made. Tax reform was also done. There were a number of very good decisions that were made by the government at that time. And so I was very pleased to see that kind of progress. And then when Stephen Harper got elected in 2004, and he, as a minority government, then later on as a majority in 2011, but he also did some very good things. I was on the Economic Advisory Council that Jim Flaherty appointed when he was Minister of Finance in 2008 to deal with the financial crisis. I saw firsthand the work that was done, especially by the Department of Finance, in dealing with the financial crisis. And also, the Harper government made a number of very good decisions, including some movement on taxation, even further movement. He got rid of the Canadian Wheat Board, which was a very poor institution to have in Canada. It was there for years, but it was certainly tremendous progress that was made in improving the distribution of grain for Canadian farmers, plus a number of other reforms that were done. So, very good government as a result. My real frustration has come since 2015, where I've seen government decisions that have been less focused on issues like productivity and growth, a movement away from the kind of fiscal discipline that we started, first under Mulroney, although he didn't do a great job at it. There were things that he should have done that he didn't do with the deficit, but it certainly was dealt with by the Liberals in the 90s. The Harper government continued it, and even with the financial crisis, Harper ended up restoring balance to the books by 2015. And so there were a lot of good things that were done, but then I started seeing that unravel. And I was getting very concerned about Canada's productivity and its growth prospects as a result of focus on redistributing income, which I think is important to have a social safety net, but not at the expense of giving up on growth. And here we are 10 years later, and I feel that my concerns are justified in terms of what I've seen over the past 10 years.
So, Jack, you were active as an economist and advisor under John Turner when he was head of the Liberal Party, under Mulroney when he was the Conservative Prime Minister, under Jean Chrétien and then Paul Martin as two successive Liberal Prime Ministers. You thought things were working. You seem happy with the general drift of things. The program review that you referred to when government was just pared back to what it needed to be was under a Liberal government in 93 onwards. And then the other reforms you initiated. And then Harper came along, and it seems to be a story of continuity through all of those years until 2015. Would that be a fair summary?
I think it would be a fair summary. And, I think, and I've written about this, there was a change in, 1980. Well, let me go back a bit. When I was a PhD student in England, I saw the difficulties that Great Britain went through with respect to having an economy that was really going downhill. There were a lot of difficulties. The exchange rate dropped like a stone. In fact, when I first came to Britain in 1975, it was $2.30 Canadian for every British pound. 1 year later, it was down to $1.68. That's a tremendous change to happen, a devaluation. And it was part and parcel of what was going on. I remember the coal strike that went on when I was there, the bread strike, where all of a sudden you couldn't buy bread, et cetera, et cetera. All these things happened. And and towards the end, that was the time when I became, when I was going back to Canada, but it was also the time that Margaret Thatcher got elected. And then, of course, Reagan got elected in 1980. And there was a big switch, actually, in public policy in the world, including Canada, where there became a focus on trying to grow the private sector by reducing the role of government or the intervention that governments had that impeded growth. In fact, when I was at finance in 1984, Mickey Cohen, who was the deputy minister at that time, prepared books for the new government, whoever it was going to be, whether it was liberal or conservative, on removing obstacles to economic growth in Canada. And it had all the sorts of things that we saw later on, privatization, tax reforms, a number, a host of policies that would really put a focus on economic growth, because previous 15 years were not very good years. And from an economic policy perspective, we didn't have very good growth, and governments inflated the economy. We had very high inflation during that period. And there were a lot of severe problems as a result of government spending that went up much faster than taxes, and huge government deficits and a pile up of debt during that period. And when the Mulroney government took over, it was to start righting the situation. And even though he did make some advancement during that period, it wasn't enough really. And really waited to the Liberals in 1993 when they got elected to start really dealing with the deficit through a very difficult 1995 budget that led to significant cuts. But it was all a way of trying to right what was going wrong. And of course, the provinces also carried out similar changes, particularly in Alberta and in Ontario. There was quite large changes that were made. But even in Saskatchewan, trying to deal with a fiscal situation, but all reflecting really a new way of looking at things philosophically in the world, going back to the Reagan and the Thatcher revolution that said, we have to rely on the market to help grow the economy. We can't just have governments trying to lead it through their various activities.
And we have terms from then like Reaganism or, Thatcherites doing their economic policy. Those were used more as epithets because not everyone was in favor of breaking up the old order, because there were different oxes that had to be gored there. Do you think it was something that when it came to Canada, through the actions of Liberal and Conservative governments, that because it had happened elsewhere already, it was maybe an easier transition for Canada to get with the program and pare back excessive spending and have a balance of growth and also redistribution?
I think the issue is balance. And that's what Canada was good at, is keeping that balance between, making sure you have good public services, a social safety net for people, but at the same time, you have spending on kind of those activities that create growth. I remember one thing I always liked about Paul Martin's budgets particularly is they were very focused, and everyone was on a very specific theme, whether it was research and development or education, for example. But those are productivity enhancing expenditures that was an emphasis during that time. And so it wasn't just tax reform or deregulation or privatization, that was carried out, but it was also really having a much better focus for government spending that really put emphasis on areas that needed to be done. And it wasn't just displaying of spending that went on over, at that time.
It feels like a different era. I remember as a lowly journalist showing up at Paul Martin's office, would have a conversation almost like this. It would be like he would explain his idea to me, and I go, "Wow, that's fascinating." And he actually took the time to meet with me when I would make my occasional forays out to Ottawa from Vancouver. I feel like we're in a different era now, where if I did that meeting, all I would get would be some sort of bizarre sound bites. It feels like we're in different times. Like, has it changed? Maybe before we go there, I just want to say that you started talking about 2015 forward and what's different. I want to come back to that in a moment. But has something changed in how people talk to each other?
Okay, I've written about this once before. In fact, I gave a speech at called the Princeton Lectures at the University of Alberta recently, and I republished it in the National Post. But basically, it's an argument that there's been a tremendous change in philosophy, public policy philosophy, over the past 25 years. And when we go back to the year 2000, it was really a period of very good growth in the world. You actually had a sharp reduction in inequality in the world, in the sense that Asian countries grew a lot and their per capita incomes grew a lot. But it came at an expense, and the expense was certain parts of the population in the advanced countries where people lost jobs, and because manufacturing went to Asia and China and et cetera. And so there became a kind of resentment towards these, this globalization and trade. There became a view that governments weren't controlling the economy anymore and well enough, and they needed to be more directive of things. And then the 2008 financial crisis, where really bad banking practices, partly as a result of the regulatory system, led to people losing their houses in Europe and in United States, and a real feeling that governments weren't doing their job very well. And it was after that period, plus the adoption of social media, that really gave a bullhorn to people, to whether it was Occupy Wall Street or later on, to voice their criticisms of what was happening. And so in the past periods, especially since 2010, we started seeing the shift in policy, where it became much more nationalistic. Governments had to control the economy. Industrial policy became in vogue. Trade became a bad thing, not a good thing, even though it allowed people to have much lower prices, consumer prices, because of trade. And so there was this tremendous shift in public policy, towards raising taxes on higher income people, pushing to have more redistribution to parts of the population. People started talking about guaranteed incomes, all sorts of other policies. But I think the concern that I had was the movement towards nationalism. And in fact, we've now seen a manifestation of that over the past year, as the Trump administration has brought in tariffs that we haven't seen before, very high levels of tariffs. All that is part of an America First strategy, which is a very nationalistic strategy. There's also been more wars happening, as we've seen in Europe and in the Middle East. But now we're starting to see governments ramping up their military expenditure, and partly pushed by the Americans to say, we no longer want to pay for it all. You're going to have to pay for it too. And so we're seeing a very different world today that kind of reminds me, unfortunately, of what happened before the First World War. And of course, we saw what happened with the ugly side of nationalism in the Second World War, when Hitler came to power and carried out the most terrible things that we still haven't forgotten about today.
It almost sounds like Trump could be seen as a historical inevitability. Is that possible?
I think it is an inevitability. I think he's an extreme form of it. When he brought in his reciprocal tariffs, I would have never thought he would bring in 50% tariff rates and things like that. But what we're seeing today in the United States and in Europe and other countries is really, I think, a manifestation of this change that I think began in 2008-9 with the financial crisis, where all of a sudden it became markets are bad, only governments can solve problems. And of course, as soon as you have only governments can solve problems, it increases or moves more and more towards nationalism, where governments have to control the borders and the country that they're running.
So how was this experienced in Canada starting in 2015? I mean, of course, we know that was when the Trudeau government took office, but you are pointing to some patterns as well that are bigger than one country.
Yeah, well, it partly started in 2008-9 in Canada as well. At that time, when the Harper government had to deal with takeovers by state-owned enterprises in the energy area, particularly in Canada, and started using national security as a way of blocking certain types of takeovers, and I didn't have a major issue on the national security side myself, but I did have a concern about state-owned enterprises taking over Canadian businesses, because here we went to a lot of length to privatize companies in Canada from crown corporations to great success, actually, in many cases. And then all of a sudden we're getting state-owned enterprises buying up Canadian businesses. And I had my concerns with that particularly.
I thought one of Canada's problems as a country is that we have a pretty small population, vast land mass. It's very hard to get the amount of capital required to develop industry. So we have to go to foreigners to say, bring us your capital and help us develop this thing here in Canada. So if it's a rich person from Europe, or it's a state-owned enterprise from Asia, or whatever it is, it's just someone with money. Isn't that a good thing if we want to develop our economy, regardless of who has that money?
I have always written that foreign direct investment is a good thing. It can improve management. It can bring new technology. But I've also written about, going back actually to my PhD thesis, I've also written about state-owned enterprises aren't all that successful. In fact, my whole PhD thesis was about public-private mixed enterprises, companies that are jointly owned by governments and private investors. And in fact, when China state-owned enterprises came in and bought Nexon and some other companies in Canada, I couldn't believe that my PhD thesis came alive again, because the state-owned enterprises from China would say, "Oh no, we're just like commercial enterprises. We're no different." And in fact, we sell shares. Some of our ownership is sold off in the market in Hong Kong or in New York. So we behave just like commercial enterprises, which was exactly opposite to what I showed in my PhD thesis 30 years earlier. Because at that time, both in Europe and Canada and several other countries, there became this view that all of a sudden we should have state-owned enterprises should partly sell their shares off, or their ownership off, to have some market discipline on, and they would perform better as companies. But that actually didn't happen. In fact, it's a very difficult relationship between government and private investors, because governments want to pursue objectives that are not just profitability, and then they start bringing in requirements that are needed. So I didn't object to foreign investment coming into Canada. I'm quite agreeable to it. My bigger problem was state-owned enterprise investments coming into Canada.
Look, we're in the middle of the federal election race. I just want to get at some of the issues that seem to be consistently at the core of what people are talking about. And I'm really surprised that in 2025, energy is a huge topic, not just before and in the early days of the race, but for weeks it's maintained. Pipelines, building pipelines. Candidates are being asked, how would they build pipelines? Would they build pipelines? And we're getting some different answers. I'm not clear whether we're getting straight answers from everybody, and I'd like you to help me find that out. So Mark Carney, leader of the Liberals, Pierre Poilievre, Conservatives, their solution, in a way, they have the same solution: streamline infrastructure and energy projects. They're both talking about that. Do you think that they are saying the right things to get those things done?
I'm actually kind of gratified that both the Liberals and the Conservatives are focused much more on growth this election. If you notice, there's hardly any discussion about starting up new programs, for redistribution. I think people are now very worried about economic growth, because if you don't have economic growth, you can't afford the redistribution programs you want. And that's why I've always been worried myself about economic growth. And unfortunately, the past decade, we have really hurt ourselves in terms of not just the oil and gas sector, in terms of getting things done, but also even in mining and other resource sectors where we could do a much better job. Because Canada, regardless of what anyone wants to say, is basically a resource-based economy. It's given us huge comparative advantage and opportunities to create wealth. And so both parties seem to be much more focused on, especially on energy, in trying to get things going. However, there is, I think, an unclear statement from the Liberals and Mark Carney vis-a-vis the oil and gas sector. They talk about having electrical transmission across the country, and there's been some discussion about maybe a pipeline from east to west, maybe to displace the imported oil that we bring from abroad. But I don't see a real commitment towards liquefied natural gas being sold internationally, or more oil being sold internationally by the Liberals, although it's very clear that the Conservatives would be willing to go in that direction. And so I still think that's a major wedge issue in this election campaign, in that we really don't have a clear view from the Liberals whether they support more oil and gas development.
Jack, there's a policy from the Trudeau time, the emissions cap. And recently, another economist, this one, the parliamentary budget officer, said it's not a cap, it's a production cap. It's not an emissions cap. It will reduce the GDP from the oil and gas sector by 5%. It'll cost, I think, 40,000 or 42,000 jobs. It's definitely a cap on production, and that's going to result in a specific economic decline. I noticed that was brushed aside almost sneeringly by Mark Carney, as if, who's this parliamentary budget officer? What does he know? It's an emissions cap, not a production cap. I mean, what do you make of this? Which is it?
Oh, it's an emissions cap that will lead to a production cap. There's no question in my mind. It's not just the PVO analysis, but it's also other analyses that have made this very clear. But it's not just that. Also, the Conservatives made clear that they want to revamp the regulatory system. Bill C-69, which, by the way, is not only makes it very difficult to build oil and gas infrastructure, but it's also very difficult to get mining projects off the ground too. And in fact, when you look at Bill C-69, it is, it was supposed to take a short period to get approvals done, but it has only been one or two projects that have actually gotten through the whole system, and it's took years to get them approved. And there's a whole bunch of projects that are in the line, but they've gone well past the first stage where there was supposed to be approvals by a certain point in time, and it hasn't been done yet. But that's not the only issue. There's not just only the emissions cap, the oil and gas emissions cap, and Bill C-69, which has really hampered the development of regulation because of all the requirements that are required that are part of that system. But also the carbon plan that is being proposed by the Liberals. And I've read that plan in quite detail. It includes new mandates, for example, for industrial emissions. It has new requirements that are going to be under the so-called industrial carbon tax that will be a lot stiffer. It includes the idea that businesses will sell credits or buy credits from not just other firms but from the private sector, which I find really concerning because I suspect that's going to be full of abuse in the end. And then there's a carbon tariff that's being proposed, which is very complicated, or border adjustments, as it's called. And that could have a very significant impact, especially since the United States is not going in that direction. And I can imagine us trying to tariff goods coming in from manufactured goods coming in from the United States because it has too much carbon associated with them.
So there's a couple of policies there where there's a very stark contrast between Mark Carney for the Liberals and Pierre Poilievre, and those first two are in that category. The emissions cap, Carney will not get rid of. Poilievre will. Bill C-69, Carney keeps. Poilievre gets rid of it. Now, they differ in this respect, but they're both saying, oh, we want to build pipelines. Well, Poilievre has some ideas about an energy corridor. That's an interesting idea. And when he's in Calgary and maybe Edmonton, Mark Carney is in favor of pipelines, but I noticed he was in Quebec, and he said something different that left it open to interpretation. Maybe pipelines aren't what's needed. Is this confusing?
It's confusing, but it also makes you question what is the real stance of the Liberals, and can you really trust what they're saying? And I think that's one of the concerns I have. Is there's a lot of promises that have been made in this election campaign. And it's kind of interesting that, governments that do get elected often like to carry out their campaign promises. Sometimes there's some that might get dropped mainly because they're unrealistic in the first place. But I do worry that actually, we've seen the Liberals try to move back to the center, but they've been comping a lot of conservative ideas. For example, not going ahead with a capital gains tax increase, but who knows? Maybe that will change. Getting rid of the fuel charge, carbon tax. But it actually hasn't been killed by legislation because of these flip-flops that are done by the Liberals. For example, on the oil and gas emissions cap is a good example. First, Mr. Carney said he wasn't going to move ahead with caps, and then 2 days later, he said, okay, I'm going to be doing it because his Minister of Environment said that. And I think part of that, it reflects what's happened to the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party moved very much to the left over the past decade. It's not the same Liberal Party that I knew in the 1990s and worked with at that time. While a leader may try to shift some of that back to the center, he doesn't necessarily have full control over the party. And there's the same people that are going to be elected if they end up winning power. It's going to be the very same people that are going to be back in the cabinet that were during the Trudeau years. And so I don't know, and I'm not convinced that we are actually going to see a major change in policy by the Liberals if they win this after this election.
There's a term they use in the Quebec press, Trudeauism. You don't really see that for whatever reason in Anglo-Canada, although it's a pretty good description of something that was around for 10 years and voters by the end got pretty sick of, and then they got rid of the guy called Trudeau, but not, it would seem, Trudeauism. So is Carney just a continuation of Trudeauism based on what we're seeing on campaign?
One thing, and I do know Mark Carney, and he is an intelligent person, and I don't doubt that he will probably make some better decisions over the next, as a prime minister. But he does have his ideology, particularly over climate change, which again will go contrary to resource development, especially in oil and gas, but also there'll be issues around agriculture. And when you read his book Values and some of the things that he said in the past, and using the financial sector to influence the way capital is going to be spent on companies that cause emissions or don't cause emissions, there'll be an allocation towards those companies that reduce emissions. So I think a lot of that is the sort of thing that we've seen over the past decade that I think will continue. And of course, this will have not only major issues vis-a-vis the economy and growth of our economy, because the oil and gas sector, the agricultural sectors, generally the resource sector is so important to Canada that it also will have some implications for national unity, because we might see a continuing alienation in Western Canada that will continue, that could have ramifications down the road in terms of what happens to Canada as a country.
Well, I see an economist who I came to associate over the last decade with that kind of a green conservative movement of carbon pricing conservatives, Christopher Reagan from McGill. And he's out saying, well, this emissions cap could provoke Western separatism in a way that we might not be ready for. The cap is causing a lot of agitation, not just in Calgary, where you might say, oh yeah, what else is new? But in Toronto, I mean, we saw business leaders who wouldn't normally be putting statements out of a partisan nature to say vote for this party. To me, I was surprised to see like 30 names of the titans of business of Bay Street saying, we're really concerned about these policies, so much so we're asking you to place your vote over here. This seems like new territory. Things have been turned upside down.
Oh, that's right. And I think that's why this is a very important election in that sense. And I think and I wrote about this a while ago after the carbon plan. That was one of the first things that Mark Carney published, was this carbon plan. He cut it out very quickly. And I said, and I went through that plan. I said, this is really replacing one carbon tax with another bigger carbon tax on big emitters. And plus there was a lot more added to it in terms of what the carbon plan would be. And I said, this will be a wedge issue, no doubt. And I think the reason why you have business leaders here in Toronto that are very concerned is you look at the story of Trans Mountain pipelines that could have been built in just a few years' time if it had gone away, but instead it took years to get developed. And now that it's finally working, which gives us an option vis-a-vis the United States in terms of selling our oil somewhere else besides the United States, it has added also 0.25 percentage points to Canada's GDP. And that's not a small number. And so, add up all these different projects that haven't been able to go through all these years is a very good example of kind of the problems that we've missed out on or we've made, and the opportunities that we missed.
After going to all the trouble of building that Trans Mountain project, now we have a government that says, you know what, let's tax that out of existence. Let's put a cap on the production of that, even though we just spent $32 billion of taxpayer money to build that project that gets that very product to market. I don't want to seem like we're just singling out Carney. Let's look at Poilievre here. He's talked about this national energy corridor. Is this a panacea? Is it a quick fix that sounds great but will fall apart as soon as you look into the details?
Well, I think it's going to be a different way of regulation. I actually, when I was director of the School of Public Policy, we actually started a series of research on the national corridor. And I look at it not just in terms of energy, but in terms of other infrastructure. And my favorite example is Australia, but there's been some other countries that followed this type of approach, where you have a corridor that's created that deals with some of the common issues that would be found with any project that would go into it, whether it's an electrical transmission line, a railway, a pipeline, or whatever. And the issues that you deal with the corridor are the kinds of things that are very important, such as the Indigenous claims, some of the maybe major environmental issues that are common to all projects, things like that. But once the corridor is approved, then the next step is if somebody wants to put in a railway, or if they want to put in a pipeline or electrical transmission line, they just need to get the project approved without adding all the things. In fact, under Bill C-69 today, and the Australians have a very fast way of getting projects approved. In fact, when I was on the board of Bearfield, we were able to get in 1 year a railway put in Western Australia in a pre-approved corridor, as an example. And I know that TransAlta was able to get an electric transmission line quickly done within a year in Australia. But in Canada, we've taken years to get these things approved. And so I think there is something to the concept of national corridor, but I wouldn't want it to be just an energy corridor that the Conservatives have mentioned. I like it to be something that would apply to any type of infrastructure that we want in order to transport goods or energy or for whatever across the lines.
A year ago, you wrote a paper, it was called, or you co-wrote, Resources Are Still Our Golden Goose. And I read that paper. I thought it was full of insights, too many to mention here, because you see natural resources. That's what resources are. And natural resources are mining and forestry and energy. And maybe we've missed some, but things that come out of the ground in some form are grown or mined or cut down. Why do you see them as so foundational to the Canadian story, Jack?
Well, of course, it goes in history back to the fur trade. And in fact, we sold lumber, fish, and other things at the beginning, when Canada first started off. But it's a huge comparative advantage for Canada, the resources. And one of the things in preparation of that paper I spent a lot of time looking at was the trade literature. And sure enough, the areas where you have comparative advantage are the ones that you end up exporting, and you actually end up creating a lot of wealth for a country and a lot of economic progress. And we were blessed with those with resources. It was kind of like manna that fell from heaven, and we should be taking advantage of that. And we shouldn't believe that. In fact, there was a view. Justin Trudeau even said it himself, that we're not a country of resources. We're going to be a country of resourceful people. Well, that's all very nice, but in fact, I was really shocked. I was looking at a website of the federal government a couple of years ago, and they talked about all the advantages of Canada, but the one thing they didn't mention was resources, and yet we built this country on the resource sector. And so when you look at our exports, our major exports, except for the auto trade, is all associated with resources, whether it's oil and gas, mining, agricultural goods. All these things are resource based. When you look at the importance of the energy sector, as well as the resource sector in general to Canada's GDP, which includes all the related industries that are at both the manufacturing and the distribution stage, and related being in the sense that a significant part of their value added is based on resources of some sort. It's like 25% of Canada's GDP in total. So it's a huge industry. It's a huge part of our life in Canada, and it's paid for a lot of the things that people want. They've gotten good salaries, so they have money in their pocket to go and buy goods and services. We've gotten taxes out of the industries that has allowed governments to provide all sorts of social services, which kind of goes back to my long run view about how important it is to have a strong economy so that you could have real prosperity in society at the same time. And that's why I've always been very focused on economic growth as a very important thing for countries like Canada.
Now, these things were true before January 20th, but 86 days into Trump 2.0, should we be thinking even more about the importance of that point?
Yes, I think that it's very important that we, think about what kind of world order we're going to have in the future. Resources are still going to be needed, no matter how the world gets reordered after what Trump is doing. And we may want to trade with other countries. In fact, I had argued in my recent piece that not only should we look to try to trade with other countries, but we should actually go back to some of the trade agreements we've had, like with Europe and Asian countries, and even go further to reduce tariffs and non-trade barriers that we can. And I hope that we can actually work out something with the United States. Maybe we'll be after Trump leaves. I think we'll be dealing with whatever we have in the United States to deal with, because in the end, we're a continent that has benefited from the strong ties that we've had between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and so I think we need to restore that wealth and think of North America as a very strong region in the world that is very important, and I think even Trump has that view. the continent itself, the North American continent itself, is really the American playpen in a sense. And of course, we don't want United States taking over Canada, nor do we want United States taking over Mexico. That would be not something that would be even conceivable, I think. But certainly working together will probably still be required, because even with trade diversification, our best economics lie with trading with the United States.
What if we fail in reaching the promise of getting resources to market?
I think that, even though we have very good education system, well-trained workforce, and we're a peaceful society here in Canada, but, the resource sector has given us the kind of comparative advantage that you don't find elsewhere, because there are other societies that have infrastructure, they have a good education system, et cetera. But unless we find an alternative, if we're just doing what everybody else is doing, we don't have any comparative advantage in doing that. And so it's going to hurt our prosperity quite a bit if we shut down that resource sector.
Jack Mintz, thanks for your insights.
My pleasure.